The morning began with a sense of foreboding, the hum of the White House filled with a nervous energy that felt different from the usual hustle. As the clock struck early, I found myself in the Oval Office once again, my fingers resting on the edge of the desk, feeling the weight of history pressing against my thoughts. Today, something significant was looming in the shadows, something beyond the usual diplomacy and the daily ebb and flow of political dealings. This morning, it was not just another briefing or another mundane decision. It was the future of Europe itself, teetering on the edge of a dangerous precipice. At precisely 7:30 a.m., Dean Rusk, our Secretary of State, called. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable sense of urgency beneath the surface. "Mr. President," he said, "we've just received new intelligence reports. The Soviets are making moves on Berlin. They're preparing for something more than just rhetoric. This could be the beginning of a very serious crisis." Berlin, the divided city that stood at the very heart of the Cold War, was once again in the spotlight, its fate hanging in the balance. I knew immediately that the stakes were higher than ever before. Rusk's words were more than just a diplomatic concern. They were a warning that the peace we had fought so hard to preserve was at risk of unraveling. The Berlin crisis was a microcosm of the larger struggle between the Soviet Union and the West, and the world was watching. Could we respond in a way that would reassure our allies without pushing the Soviets too far? This was the question that weighed heavily on my mind. I ended the call with Rusk and immediately gathered my National Security Council in the cabinet room. The hour was early, but the seriousness of the situation demanded it. By 9:30 a.m., I was seated at the head of the table, surrounded by some of the most brilliant minds in the country. McGeorge Bundy, my National Security Advisor, Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, and a few trusted military officials. Each of them entered the room with a look of concern that mirrored my own. The conversation began in earnest. "What do we know?" I asked, my voice steady despite the tension. "What's the latest intelligence on Berlin? Are they really preparing for a military move?" Rusk leaned forward, his face grim. "Yes, Mr. President. We've received credible reports that Soviet forces are moving into East Germany and could make a move on Berlin at any moment. This could be a prelude to a larger confrontation." As the meeting continued, it became clear that we were facing a critical moment in history. If the Soviets decided to act, we couldn't afford to hesitate. Berlin, a city divided between East and West, was the flashpoint for the larger ideological struggle between capitalism and communism. If we allowed the Soviets to take control of the city, it would have profound consequences, not just for Germany, but for the entire Western world. Robert McNamara, with his usual analytical approach, was quick to offer a solution. "We need to be prepared for any contingency," he said. "Our military readiness is crucial. If they move on Berlin, we must act swiftly and decisively. But we must also consider our response to prevent further escalation. This is not just about Berlin. It's about the balance of power in Europe." Bobby, my brother, was more direct. "Jack, we can't show any weakness. We've been tested before, but this is different. If we back down, it's not just Berlin that's at risk. Our entire alliance could collapse. The NATO allies are watching us. If we don't act, it could set a precedent that we'll regret for years to come." I looked around the room, weighing the gravity of their words. I knew Bobby was right. If we showed even a hint of hesitation, it would embolden the Soviets. But at the same time, the last thing I wanted was for this to escalate into a full-blown war. The stakes were incredibly high. We spent hours discussing options, examining military strategies, and considering the broader implications of every decision. The idea of a direct military response seemed unpalatable. We needed to send a strong message, but we couldn't afford to let this conflict spiral out of control. After what felt like an eternity, we settled on a course of action. We would send a clear message to the Soviets that Berlin was non-negotiable, but we would also take steps to de-escalate the situation diplomatically. We had to ensure that our commitment to defend Berlin was made clear, without provoking an all-out war. By the time the meeting ended, it was clear that this was not just a decision about Berlin. It was about the very nature of American leadership in the Cold War. Could we maintain the trust of our allies? Could we show the world that we were strong enough to stand firm, even in the face of overwhelming pressure? The weight of these questions would stay with me throughout the day. At noon, I met with Chancellor Adenauer's representative, Hans von der Bruggen, in the Oval Office. Adenauer had always been a staunch ally, and in this moment of crisis, it was crucial that we reaffirm our commitment to his country's security. Von der Bruggen arrived with a sense of solemnity, understanding the gravity of the moment. We had to make it clear to him that the United States would not abandon its commitment to Berlin, no matter the cost. As we sat across from each other, I could sense his apprehension. The situation in Europe was volatile, and he needed reassurance that the United States would not back down. I leaned forward, meeting his gaze. Chancellor Adenauer's security is paramount to us, I said firmly. Berlin is the front line of the free world. We will not allow the Soviets to push us back. The United States is committed to standing with Germany. There was a brief silence, and then a subtle nod from von der Bruggen. I could see that the weight had lifted from his shoulders, if only slightly. He understood that the United States was not just a passive observer in this struggle. We were leaders, and we would lead with unwavering resolve. Later that afternoon, I met privately with Jackie in the quiet of the White House. The decisions of the day had been heavy, and I needed a moment of peace. We talked about our children, our plans for the future, and the simple joys that grounded us. In the midst of all the turmoil, it was comforting to focus on what truly mattered, the love of family. Jackie's support was unwavering, and in her company, I found solace from the storm of decisions that raged outside the walls of our home. As the day wound down and the weight of the decisions began to settle, I found myself reflecting on the meaning of leadership. Leadership is not about the grand speeches or the applause. It's about the quiet, difficult decisions made behind closed doors. It's about standing firm when the world seems to be in chaos and knowing that your choices will define the future. Tonight, I rest knowing that we made the right decision. We stood by our allies, we stood by Berlin, and we stood by the principles that define the free world. John F. Kennedy.